one way to think of it is that what got you to the table isn't necessarily going to keep you at that table or create other opportunities for you. You have to demonstrate that you can function beyond that corporate function. I feel like I've been very fortunate because throughout my executive career, I've been able to bring my leadership to organizations at various stages of growth. So I spent some time at a startup in technology services, time at a national financial services organization who grew by acquisition, and for the last decade of my executive career, a global institutional investor and pension plan. And in each of those environments, I was able to advance strategic business priorities through delivering high-impact people and culture agendas. And my board service started about a decade ago. While still in my executive career, I was very drawn to the mission of the Boys and Girls Clubs of Canada and was invited to join their national board. And at the time, my executive career was quite full, which meant minimal time to give back to community. So I got great advice from a mentor who told me to choose carefully. And that's a piece of advice I give executives these days who ask me how to start doing more board work. So choose carefully because you only have so much time to give. And I feel that I learned a tremendous amount by joining a not-for-profit charitable board and brought those experiences with me, not only throughout the rest of my executive career, but also into other board roles. And that board was the one I served on for the longest until about a month ago when I reached my term limit and I stepped down, having been the chair of the national board for my final 2 years. Outside of that board, the rest of my board portfolio took shape over the last 5 years when I made the decision to transition from an executive career into a board career. And I took the time to, frankly, intentionally design a portfolio that now includes 2 TSX listed companies and a large Canadian university. And so because of the experiences from my executive career, I can bring a broad range of perspectives to board discussions, which means that my impact is felt differently at each of those tables, and particularly as it pertains to talent and culture discussions. As a former chief people officer, I can bring insights and experiences, having designed high-impact people and culture programs that may be different from others around the table. My board service started about a decade ago with the Boys and Girls Clubs of Canada. I was approached about that board by the CEO, who was a connection in my network. And that was the longest serving board up until about a month ago, when I stepped down from that organization, having been the chair for my final 2 years. My 2 TSX listed boards are Empire Company, which is the Sobeys food retailing organization, and Stella Jones, which is a leading North American manufacturer of supporting infrastructure for electrical distribution and railway transportation systems. So at Empire, I'm the chair of the Human Resources Committee. And with Stella Jones, I'm a member of both the Human Resources and Governance Committees. And interestingly enough, I learned about both of those roles through an executive search firm. And it was a firm I had worked with for many years when I was an executive. And so I know that opportunities surface via different methods. And so those two happen to have been through a search firm. And, during those processes, I was reminded about the power of one's network, which for me meant people I could tap into, not only to learn more about the management teams in those organizations or other directors, but also to learn more about questions I may want to ask or things I might want to learn more about as part of my personal due diligence. So the outreach into my network while pursuing both of those roles was very helpful, not only for the reasons I just mentioned, but because I believed, and actually I've had it confirmed, that individuals in those organizations also tapped into their network to get some information on me. So the diligence happens both ways. So not only my diligence, but their diligence on me. The opportunity with Empire Company was also quite special to me and probably atypical, because that organization was building a pipeline of directors for future succession opportunities. And they were willing to invest in me as a new corporate director. So when I joined that board, I did not have prior public company director experience. I was a senior executive, and as a chief people officer was in the C-suite, and I had other governance experience, including governance education. But I like to say that Empire Company built a chair for me at that table by asking me what kind of wood I wanted it made out of. They put my name on it and created space by pulling it up to the table for me. Because I was also a net new addition to the board. I was not replacing anyone on that board. And once I gained a few years of experience on that board, I was then a more attractive candidate for the Stella Jones board. They wanted somebody who not only had a human resources background and that kind of experience, they also wanted a director who had prior public company experience. And so while I might be a former chief people officer at each of those tables, an important thing I always like to share with aspiring directors is the importance of performing at a boardroom table beyond your corporate function. So I don't show up at those tables as just the person who had an HR background. I have to build credibility in that board ecosystem and in those rooms by demonstrating capabilities and skills beyond that. And so in addition to Empire Company and Stella Jones, I also have the real pleasure of serving on the board of governors for Western University here in Canada. I happen to be the chair of the Governance and Bylaws Committee. And I learned of that opportunity because of other work that I do as an alumnus of Western with an advisory council for the Faculty of Arts and Humanities. That opportunity is an example of how demonstrating commitment and credibility in one opportunity can lead to another. The first thing I would say is build your toolkit and your brand early in your career. And as part of that, my encouragement would be to think about gaining as much breadth and depth of experience you can. I mentioned earlier that to really establish credibility in the board ecosystem, you need to be able to demonstrate capability beyond your core function. And so while one's career might focus on a particular profession, really being able to maybe take some risk and broaden one's horizons and capabilities in whatever way makes sense, always, I think, contributes to a nicely well-rounded toolkit that is easier to demonstrate at a boardroom table. Second piece of advice I would have is to remember the power of your network. I was approached about board roles, not necessarily from individuals within my network, but the importance of that network as I wanted to learn more. And frankly, as those organizations and those boards considering me tapped into. So the power of your network goes both ways. Remember that as you shape your network. And I think the third and final piece of advice I would give is to own your value proposition and evolve it as your expertise grows. So one of the very interesting experiences for me personally was, as a former chief people officer, it's easy for somebody to check a figurative box to say, okay, Michelle brings, human capital expertise and she brings the HR expertise to the table. What I recognized, though, was The organizations I had the pleasure of spending my executive career in included, again, a startup, a national financial services organization who grew by acquisition, and a global institutional investor and pension plan. What I needed to demonstrate in my value proposition was that I have a real deep curiosity and a builder's mindset. And that started early in my career in helping to shape a startup. And when I got to play a role in each of those organizations and their various stages of growth, that builder mindset meant deep curiosity, which is a real skill set that board directors need to have at the table. And so that was an element of my value proposition I needed to learn how to weave in. In addition, I sat at tables in an HR capacity that created other breadth for me. I was at a global institutional investor. I understand capital allocation models. I was on the transaction approval committee for high impact investments. That doesn't necessarily jump off the page of somebody who spent a typical HR career building one. So you have to start to weave these key differentiators into your value proposition. And I learned how to consider that as my board career grew as well, because now I have broader expertise that I can bring to the table, having spent the last number of years at boardroom tables. So build your toolkit and your brand early, remember the power of your network, and own your value proposition and evolve it as your expertise grows.